Trekking poles, as I understand it, can be somewhat of a divisive topic among hikers and campers and outdoors people. And frankly, I'm one of those naysayers. I've been sort of anti, haven't really been into it. Often even have been found to mock some of those that do, including my brother, who thinks that they just put him in four-wheel drive. So I'm gonna take his advice this time and that of many others who say they are awesome, and I'm just gonna give it a whirl. So if you're wondering too what it's like to try trekking poles for the first time, well, you're gonna see it here. I am trying trekking poles for the very first time on this backpacking trip. I'm here in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, very fortunate and glad to be here. And I'm just gonna take you along for the journey. Let's see what it's like. Are these things worth the hype or not?
Gear up and get outside.
I just got back from my 25-mile-ish hiking trip through the Wind River Range. We did the Cirque of the Towers and it was amazing. I took advantage of that trip to try trekking poles for the first time. We're going to talk about what my first impressions were, what trekking poles are all about. There are likely other much better trekking pole videos out there by trekking pole veterans that probably have some more pointed advice based on years of experience with them. That is not me, but if you are also a hiking pole noob, this might be interesting to you anyhow. Let's start with a little bit of trekking poles 101. From my pre-game research, these are the reasons why people use trekking poles. Number one would be stability and balance on various terrain. I did think that was true. I wasn't sure at first on gentle slopes, but as I continued to climb up steeper passes and things, I did find it to be helpful to have more points of contact with the ground as I was going up a steep slope. They can also certainly help with downhill segments, especially when your knees are kind of wobbly or maybe you have knee problems or past knee injuries. I'm sure it would be very helpful for those folks. But for me, after going up a steep pass, Texas Pass, if anyone's done that hike, and then coming down the other side, that was a long and steep decline and my legs were jelly at that point. So it really did help to sort of have additional points of contact with the ground. People also like them for stream crossings. Just helps you not slip off those rocks or have something to grab onto if you do, and muddy trails as well. Another common reason a lot of folks like to use trekking poles is to help prevent injury or just for safety. Especially if you have compromised joints, this can help protect your joints or at least give you something else to put weight and lean on or catch yourself when you trip so that you don't further injure yourself. So if you're doing any kind of high impact hiking or high intensity hiking, especially with a heavy load, trekking poles can be an advantage, and you could maybe even use them in some way to improvise in a first aid or emergency situation. People also like trekking poles because they can be multi-use. You can use them to set up a tent if you've got a trekking pole compatible tent. So I got one of these tents where you can use your trekking pole in place of the tent pole. They can also be used as shooting sticks if you're a hunter. Some people put a little mount on them and use them as a selfie stick. So there's lots of different things you might be able to do with them besides just hiking with them. And a very popular one that people like to talk about is it's like putting yourself in four-wheel drive. Again, this is what my brother told me. This is why he said you have to try it. Four-wheel drive, all right, I don't have any wheels, so I don't totally buy that, but it does give you a little bit more of that feel like you're some kind of ungulate climbing up the mountain. It gives your hands something to do. It can just be more comfortable. I did find that my hands didn't swell up like they normally do when I don't use trekking poles and they're swinging at my sides all day. So I did appreciate that. Overall, they just engage your arms and help distribute some of that weight from your pack onto your arms. And I've even heard people claim it makes them faster. Now I know a lot of ultra runners and trail runners like to use them as well. I'm still slow and portly, so that didn't make me any faster, but I think some people just think about trekking poles like kids do about their new shoes. You know, the shoe is judged based on how fast it makes you, even though it has nothing to do with that. A shout out to Get Out Gear. They sent me these trekking poles for this video. Unfortunately, they didn't arrive before my trip, so I took some other ones. Given that I'm so new to trekking poles right now, I'm pretty indifferent as to which ones I use, but they've got a relatively inexpensive carbon fiber trekking pole that might be interesting for you to check out. All right, so when did I appreciate having trekking poles the most on my first hike with them? I thought they were most helpful for going uphill and steeper uphills. I also thought they were helpful on steep downhill segments, keep my balance and to keep me from falling over when I had jelly legs at the end of the day. After a thorough test, I can confirm that in capable human hands, trekking poles can go both uphill and downhill. Trekking poles assisted me, as you can see, in climbing this hill. I did find them useful on stream crossings, although I could have survived without them certainly, but I could definitely cruise across those rocks more quickly with a little bit lower risk of falling in and get my feet wet. I also thought they were useful over scree, you know, those small loose rocks on a steep slope. They were handy to have in those segments. While at first I didn't really like having it on just kind of the typical trail terrain. First impressions, I'm not quite sure what purpose they serve on flat ground. It seems like extra work. Not quite sure what to do with my hands. I feel like Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights.
I'm not sure what to do with my hands.
By the end of that trip, I really liked them just on those kind of standard hiking trail segments where you've got some undulating terrain where you're gradually climbing or gradually descending. You've got a nice wide trail and you can really get into rhythm just cruising. I did like having them there. I liked having my hands and arms engaged more. However, there were also times when I was annoyed by them, and one of those times was just on flat trails. When there's really nothing happening, I really don't need them, it's not rigorous at all, it's just smooth, flat, big meadows, and I had two more things I had to think about. It almost prevented me from looking up and enjoying the scenery a little bit. But where I really found them annoying was when the trail was really narrow, especially if it was flat and narrow. Now, some of these well-trodden trails like the Cirque of the Towers and the Winds have a lot of these segments where they go through beautiful meadows or things, where the trail sits 4 or 5 inches below the rest of the terrain and especially all that vegetation. And when that happens, you've got two options. Either you stick your poles outside of the trail and you might be post holing, and that could be kind of not the best practice for leave no trace. It also makes them higher up here and it's just less comfortable and useful. Or you try to keep them inside the trail bed, which either I was poking my toes with them or I was kicking them with my heels and they just weren't useful. So narrow trail segments were kind of annoying. I just started putting them on my pack during those. I also didn't love them through boulder fields and big kind of rocky segments of the trail. I felt bad scratching rocks. There's a lot of clanking going on. They're clanky. You don't. It was a lot of that. It's kind of noisy, a bit of a racket that isn't super pleasant when you're hiking around. The carbide tips don't grip well in that situation anyway, so it's hard to find a good place to plant, and usually it doesn't really help you keep your balance. And in some of those boulders going over them, this would even slip out, so it's almost more of a hazard. So I found myself just carrying them in my hands while I kind of worked my way through boulder fields. I also wasn't a big fan of just using a single trekking pole. Now, a buddy of mine I was on this trip with does like that, and that's what he does. So I think it's a matter of personal preference, but I tried that for a while and I just felt lopsided. What are the drawbacks of trekking poles? Well, I see two big ones. One is its added weight. Every time you take another piece of gear, you are adding weight to your pack. Some people think that is essential weight. I think it is optional weight, especially if you start out with some cheap aluminum ones that could be very heavy. The other downside I see is cost. Now, trekking poles are not necessarily a cheap piece of gear. They can be well upwards of $200 and some really high-end ones into several $100s. A typical trekking pole probably costs between $100 and $200. However, there are some cheaper options that are below $100, including these. Otherwise, they can cost as much as a pack or a sleeping bag. So the big question, will I be using trekking poles again? Well, when I reflect on it, my life is 99.9 with a line over top of it % the same as it was before I tried trekking poles. The only real difference being that now I have tried trekking poles. But yes, I probably will use trekking poles again because right now I feel like we're still in the friend zone and I want to see if there's any real romance between me and a couple of trekking poles, as has been described by my brother and many other middle-aged, wobbly-kneed gearheads. I'll probably also try them on a hunting trip and try using them as shooting sticks. I've heard good things about that. But I won't use them all the time and they're not on my necessary gear list. Speaking of backpacking items that you don't need, you ought to go and watch this video next where I talk about backpacking gear you don't need but that you probably want. If you like this video, show us by hitting the like button below. That really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel for more gear reviews and gear tips like this. Now gear up and get outside.